Now it is time for today's Perspective guest. And today is the UN World Day to combat desertification and drought. And to mark that here on the World Today, we're going to talk now about the cryosphere, the term for regions of our planet, of course, that are covered in ice and snow. Areas, then, at major risk from both drought and temperature changes. Now, in its latest report on the cryosphere, the International Cryosphere Climate Initiative headlines by saying that a 2 degrees rise in temperature would mean that all of the Earth's frozen parts would experience irreversible damage with disastrous consequences for millions of people, societies, and of course for nature. Joining us now is founder and director of the International Cryosphere Climate Initiative, Pam Pearson. She's a former US diplomat, 20 years of experience working on global issues. Thanks very much for being with us on the programme today. If there was then a 2 degrees rise in temperatures, what could that mean?
Well, and thank you very much for having me. You know, this is, in a way, the third kind of crisis that's happening right now. It can be very difficult to focus on this with Gaza, with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But the reality is this crisis is going on right now, and it will indeed be irreversible. Parts of it are right now already. There's a very good chance, for example, that the West Antarctic ice sheet has already tipped, but we can slow it down so that we're probably looking at maybe 3 meters of sea level rise that we can no longer stop, but we may be able to stretch it out to 800 or 1,000 years. Glaciers, especially tropical glaciers, are disappearing incredibly quickly right now. And Venezuela lost its last glacier, La Corona Glacier, sometime in the past year. And so these have inevitable consequences for humans. Just this morning, the group ICIMOD, which is an international organization focused on the Himalayas, advised the countries in that region to prepare for drought this year because snow is at a record low amount in river basins such as the Indus. And so this is ongoing. It's sort of the slow crisis, but the inevitable crisis. And it's something we have to focus on and that we can still prevent the worst of if we can stick to 1.5 degrees. But unfortunately, we're not on that track in any way, shape or form right now.
And those kind of rises of sea levels, what does that technically mean? How much of the land mass is that effectively going to be swallowed up by the sea?
Well, that still depends on us, right? Because it can be as much as 3 meters early next century. That would wipe out, for example, most of southern Bangladesh. The capital of Dhaka would become an island. The country of the Bahamas would be wiped out entirely because it's all pretty much below 3 meters. Probably just with 1 meter, about 200 million people, according to the IPCC, will be displaced, even with 1 meter of sea level rise. So 3 meters is incredible. But the thing with ice is it responds slowly, but once it responds, you can't stop it. And that's the kind of alarm we're trying to rise. Because when I'm talking about these very high levels of sea level rise, 2,100, these 3 meters, that's just the beginning. If we've kicked that in, the IPCC has said up to 15 meters cannot be ruled out by 2,300. And the important message is, if we go down later, if we can bring temperatures down after peaking at 2 degrees, these processes can no longer be stopped at that point. And if we reach 3 degrees, and we're aiming for somewhere between 2.5 and 3 degrees right now, even if all of our current commitments are met, then at that point, these really high levels probably become inevitable and much sooner than we thought.
It's very difficult, isn't it, for a lot of people to kind of visualise exactly what it means, particularly if they live perhaps in big cities. Me, sitting here in Paris, for example. I mean, that brief glacier that you mentioned, La Corona, becoming too small to be classed as a glacier, makes Venezuela, doesn't it, the first country in the Andes mountain to lose all its glaciers. It's something concrete that people can kind of get hold of and really understand.
Exactly. And it won't be, the last country to lose theirs. These tropical glaciers are really tiny.
OK, let me ask you, carry on. You were talking about La Corona.
Yes, I was talking about La Corona, and there is another, it won't be the last glacier lost because one of the last tropical glaciers, really the only remaining glaciers in the Pacific, is on the border of Indonesia and Papua New Guinea. That is disappearing inevitably. Sometime in the next 2 years, that glacier is going to be gone as well. And so this is simply going to continue as long as we keep on pushing fossil fuel emissions really into the atmosphere. There's nothing we can do to halt this process other than to bring these down really, really sharply and as soon as possible. So that's why this is so urgent. It's not something that it's okay to delay it until 2040 or 2050, because then we're going to be pushing these dynamics into place. And again, we won't be able to stop them.
Do you despair a little bit with politicians and, to be honest, with voters as well? I mean, we've just had the European elections a week ago. The Green Party doing very badly in those elections. I mean, as you mentioned, people perhaps are too busy following the situation in Gaza, following the situation in Ukraine, other conflicts, other major issues around the world, to perhaps concentrate enough on environmental issues.
Right. And that's the danger. But I think then it's really up to the scientific community to bring it home and to talk about how this has an impact on people's daily lives, that the heat that we see, that the lack of water that we see, that's related to the world's ice. So these areas seem to be really far away from us, but in reality, they have an impact on our daily lives. And I think that's really up to us to communicate. And again, to communicate the irreversibility, that we cannot bring this back. You know, I think a lot of people think about climate change sometimes like air pollution, right? And if you can bring good air quality back or good water quality, you know, decrease the pollution, things will go back to the way they were. That's not how the cryosphere works. Once it kicks in, it keeps on going. And so really, if we lose the cryosphere, in a way, we will lose the planet that we know, because it's going to go into a different state. And so it is urgent, even though it seems so very far away.
And what can people actually do about it? I mean, I was sitting around the dinner table on Friday night with a lot of younger people in their early 20s, and they were saying, we just don't know what we can do other than doing a little bit more recycling than we do. You know, what else is there that people can kind of actually physically do to try and solve these problems?
Well, I mean, probably the most important thing they can do goes back to your earlier comment. They can vote, right? They can vote politicians who are eager and willing to take this seriously and to address it with the urgency that it requires, but also just decreasing your own carbon footprint as much as possible and encouraging others to do the same, because that's really the only way that we can act on this. But there is so much that can be done by individuals to cut down on their carbon footprint. And if this is seen as a priority by everyone, we can really have an impact.
Pam Pearson, thank you very much. Glad we managed to get the line back working again. Pam Pearson, Director of the International Cryosphere Climate Initiative. Thank you for joining us.